We are here. Hi, Jill.
Hi, Ashley. How are you?
I am doing very well. I am very excited about today's event for many reasons, not the least of which is I was just lamenting to my husband that I've really let the garden grow or let the garden go lately, and I've been craving some like a refresh and motivation for how to get back on the vegetable tending train and flower tending train. So this feels very relevant for me selfishly. Uh, Audience, excited to have you all here. I can see we already have folks who are letting us know where they're coming in from. Kathy in Long Island. Sue Molly, good to see you. If you all wouldn't mind just letting us know in the chat that you can see us and hear us. That way we'll be sure that you're collecting all of Jill's wisdom here today. And also maybe let us know where you're tuning in from and what your is there a favorite vegetable, fruit, garden garden plant that you love to work with? And is there something specific maybe that you're hoping to learn today? So go ahead and drop that in the chat. Okay, thanks so much, Kathy. Glad to know that we're visible and hearable. My name's Ashley with the Discover team here at Teachable, and I am thrilled to be able to host this session with Jill today. She is, I love this story because I've always kind of wished that, I had some like generational gardening wisdom passed down from the families, the family farm or whatever it is, but we didn't really have that. We were kind of like, suburban, maybe had the landscapers come over every now and again to kind of clean up the grass, but never really got to do much gardening. And now that I'm an adult, we've got some space, and I'm so curious to learn, but I've been intimidated because it's not something that I know a lot about, and I'm constantly worried about whether I am over or underwatering my plants. And Jill is somebody who not only, didn't grow up gardening per se, but came to this a little bit later after, figuring out what makes people tick. She studied psychology in school. Now she's decided to explore this landscape of what makes plants tick and what makes them connect with the earth, and how do we tend to that connection. She's an incredible blogger and an author, and I'm really excited to kind of get down to some basics today for a thriving garden. Jill, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. And let me tell you that the feeling you're having right now is completely normal. I've heard from so many people, even veteran gardeners, that garden burnout is real right now. But
I
hopefully,
bet.
most of us are harvesting something. So hopefully, this will be a timely talking about how we can preserve what we have, even if we don't feel like working in the garden. Maybe we have some things that are harvesting that we can do something with.
Such a good point. I hadn't thought about it that way, but I do remember at the beginning of the pandemic being, feeling so good to have the opportunity to be in the dirt, and my roses were looking great. Everything was in good shape, but here we are 18 months later, and yes, fatigue. That's a really good way of putting it. I imagine. Yeah. Well, that's good to know. And thank you, Kathy, into tomatoes, cucumbers, and beans. I've been eating, I love cucumbers and tomatoes. Those are like my favorite. Enhancing and enriching soil is something that you want to learn about. Okay. So we have a lot of different paths to explore here. Just so everybody knows, before I turn it over to Jill, we will offer a replay of this session. So if you're registered and you either missed the live stream or missed the beginning, don't fret. We will send you a link to the replay that'll have all the resources that Jill mentions. linked through there, and you'll be able to view it on the YouTube channel, which is where you are right now. Wanted to note that Jill's full course is linked it's pinned to the top of the YouTube page. So definitely check that out. She's got some great stuff that we'll continue to talk about throughout today's session, including a garlic course their workshop that I'm very interested to learn about. So stick around for that. If you have questions, if there's anything that you want to talk about throughout the session, type those into the chat. I'll be hopping on and off screen, but I can always see the chat, and we'll make sure that we dive into the things that you want to make sure we cover before we run out of time today. So without any further ado, Jill, over to you, my friend.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to pull up my slides here. Can you tell me when they're visible? So I know when
they're visible. Okay. There they are. And I'm going to jump backstage, but I'll still be able to hear everybody and chat with you all in the chat.
Okay, sounds good. Well, today we're going to be talking about simplest paths for preserving your harvest, because that's pretty much the state that a lot of us are in right now in early September. Is the harvest is coming on, whether it's been coming on for a while, like people like in my climate, I've been harvesting for several months, but a lot of people are just really starting to get their harvest going. So sometimes many times want to eat our harvest fresh because that's the best way to eat it. But a lot of us do want to figure out how to preserve, not only to save it for the winter, but also sometimes we just get too much that we can't eat it all at once fresh, even if we want to. So what we're going to be talking about today is different ways that you can preserve your harvest that aren't too difficult. And so what we're going to learn today is 4 beginner methods for food preserving. And then we're going to talk about the pros and the cons of each of those, and then what equipment you might need. And finally, really the whole crux of this is to help you decide how to use it in your garden's harvest, which method is right for you, or which combination of methods. We're going to talk about the time requirements for each method, like I said, the pros and cons, and so you can have a better idea of what type of preserving might fit you, your garden, your schedule individually, because it's not going to be the same for all of us. By the time we get done, my goal is for you to know which methods are right for you, your harvest this season, but also in the seasons to come. And that way, if you are just getting your harvest coming in now, you kind of have an idea where you want to begin. And then, as Ashley mentioned, at the end, I'll talk to you about my course, Harvest to Kitchen, where I bring you into my kitchen and I show you what I do with my harvesting and preserving in lots of different ways. For those of you who would like more of a hands-on teaching on this, something I wish that I had, something that our grandmothers used to teach us, but I know I didn't get that. So this is an opportunity if you want to go a little bit further once we talk about the basics of these preserving methods. And then, as Ashley mentioned, we'll do some Q&A at the end, but hopefully we'll also do some Q&A kind of interspersed here if you have any questions on any particular types of preserving as we go. We'll try to address some of those if any of those questions come up. So many people, when it comes to deciding how they're going to preserve their harvest, they have these 3 questions, because I've asked people. They want to know where to start because they don't have any idea. And with a lot of us who don't have a background in food preserving or gardening, we don't know where to start. Another question is, do I have the time for this? I think sometimes we underestimate how much time preserving food actually takes. And so you are trying to figure out, can I even fit this in my schedule? And if so, how do I do it? Or if I have a certain amount of time, a small amount of time, what can I do to get the most bang for my buck with the time that I have? And then a big fear that people have, especially with canning when they've never done it before, is this safe? And so those are some of the things that we are going to be talking about today. And hopefully by the end, you'll be able to have some of these questions answered for you. Because if you're like me, you want to make the most of your harvest, because I know we're all tired, but you put in a lot of work to get to this point, and you want to make the most of what you have. You don't want it to go to waste. You want it to serve you and your family, not only now, but in the months to come. And you want to do this without guessing which methods are right for you, without wondering if you're going to do it safely, and without spending your summer slaving over a canning pot, because I've absolutely been there. And some of the things that we're going to be talking about today will hopefully help in the time management issue that some of us have. So if you're new here, I wanted to just quickly introduce myself, because if you haven't met me before, you probably have no idea who I am and why I'm talking about this. But I am a self-taught food preserver. And I say self-taught because I didn't have anyone coming beside me teaching me how to do these things. I started my first garden in 2013, my very first garden, and I started it because I became a stay-at-home mom and I wanted to do what I could to support my family by growing our own food. And I knew that food preservation was a priority even that first season, because my goal was to grow as much food as I could for our family. And I started out very small. My mom and I went to a bookstore, a resale bookstore, and we bought an old copy of the Ball Blue Book of Canning. I say old, but it was probably in the early 90s is when it was published. But I got it and I read it cover to cover. And that's how I started, was just that one book. And then over the years, thankfully, you've got YouTube and you've got more resources online. I've been able to learn that way. But a lot of my learning, most of my learning has honestly just been by doing. And so that's where I'm coming from as I'm showing you these methods. Most of what I'm sharing with you has a background of the research that I've done, but it's more so what I've seen in my own practice. And as I see here, as I'm saying here, I'm learning every year. I'm trying new things every year. I'm learning more things about how to be more efficient with my food preserving. And so I'm hoping that the years that I've done this, I'm hoping that it will help you as well. So can you imagine home canned tomato products and other veggies that are ready to go in the winter? That is one of the most rewarding things of preserving your own harvest, is having those jars at the ready. And there's just nothing like it, but you have to get there somehow first, right? Can you imagine having a freezer full of your garden's harvest for months? Maybe you could have space-saving dehydrated onions and peppers for winter soups and stews. And along with that, what you're going to notice, the more you embrace food preserving, you're going to notice that your grocery list gets shorter and shorter every year. And I have noticed that food prices have been going up. And so the more that you can preserve your own harvest, that one jar of whatever you're canning, whether it's a salsa, that is one jar of salsa you don't have to buy. And you start adding that up, and it really does make a difference in your grocery bill. And finally, a peace of mind. We have, I think, in this last year and a half, have been introduced to the fear that, there could be food supply issues. And, I'm not saying that, the sky is falling, but I think for a lot of us, there is some kind of a peace of mind knowing that no matter what happens, I do have some of my home canned or frozen or dehydrated food put back for my family. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and jump in to the 4 easy ways to preserve your garden's harvest so that you can choose what fits your garden, your kitchen, and your lifestyle best. So the first one we're going to talk about is freezing, because I would say that's probably the easiest one to get started with. The pros to freezing would be, number one, it's fast. It's fast to do. It doesn't require a whole lot of time. It requires less equipment than some of the other methods we're going to talk about today. And some people just enjoy the preference of frozen foods better, or specific frozen foods better. So I talked to a man the other day. He emailed me, and he and his family love frozen peas. And so that's the only way they can imagine eating those peas is to freeze them. So the texture preference is a definite issue. If you like frozen vegetables, then freezing would be a good idea for some of those. The cons of freezing would be, number one, you've got to have freezer space. And so sometimes that can be a limiting factor if you don't have an extra freezer, or you don't have a lot of room to be able to allocate to those vegetables, because they can take a lot of room. Another con is that freezing, as compared to canning and dehydrating, has a limited shelf life. Usually it's about 8 to 12 months, which for a lot of us, that's plenty. But if you're wanting to have a little bit more than that, the canning and dehydrating are going to give you a longer shelf life. And then we've got the whole issue of blanching. Sometimes, actually most of the time, blanching is required. Now, if you're not sure what blanching is when you dip your vegetable in boiling water for a certain amount of time. Usually it's a minute to 3 minutes. It's very short. And then immediately after that, you plunge it in an ice bath. And so you're basically starting to cook it, but then stopping the cooking process. And what this does is it helps your final project have better texture. It inhibits some of the word's failing me now, but it's a technical term that happens when you have food that's frozen. It's basically the natural breakdown of the cell walls of the vegetable. So blanching will prohibit that from happening as fast. And so from a safety standpoint, blanching isn't necessarily. It's mainly about a final product standpoint. I have too many words in my head right now. So you can find things online, lots of articles about, freeze green beans, no blanching required, or freeze corn, no blanching required. And technically that's true. You can freeze them without blanching, but there's a reason why the experts, such as the National Center for Home Food Preservation, recommend blanching, and it's because of the final product. I did freeze corn one year without blanching, and it was my entire corn harvest, and it was awful. The texture, the flavor was not good. Once I started blanching corn instead, I realized why they recommended blanching. So I say that that's a con because that does take an extra step. Now, the good news is not all vegetables and fruit require blanching to freeze them. For example, if you are freezing something for flavor only, such as peppers or onions or celery, and it's going to go into a soup, or it's going to have some kind of just a flavor issue, you're not going to need to blanch that. You're really going to be talking about vegetables that you're going to eat as they are, like carrots or corn or peas or green beans. Those are going to have a better final product and a longer shelf life if you blanch them. And then you've got other fruit like blueberries. I would never blanch. I put them directly in the freezer, no problem. But in general, most of your vegetables do better when they're blanched. So basic equipment needed for freezing. If you just want to do the bare minimum, you can do freezer bags. I do recommend that you don't skimp on the brand. Get a high quality brand of freezer bags, because I've noticed that the shelf life in the freezer is definitely correlated with the amount of money I pay for the freezer bags. So get a good brand. If you want to go a little bit more advanced, you can do a vacuum sealer, and that's pretty much what I do most of the time now. I use my Food Saver vacuum sealer, the one you see in the photo here. I don't even think they make that model anymore, but it's lasted me probably 8 years at least, and it's done really well. And it takes out, as you can see, the peppers on the left here, it takes out all of the oxygen, or as much as it can, and that enables the shelf life to be longer than it would be with a freezer bag. And then you'll also need freezer space if you are looking into freezing. So if you're trying, yes.
Before we go on into the freezing, the freezing discussion, I'm curious, are there particular guidelines for how to know if you should blanch something or not? Like so between blueberry and corn, what is it that makes the difference? Is it water content? I'm just kind of curious to how do you know?
Well, I can't tell you exactly as far as water content. That's a good idea, a good question. But I always go by that website, the National Center for Home Food Preservation.
Just kind of checking, see what they say.
A lot of words, but yeah, they have it all listed on their website. And to me, blueberries is kind of an anomaly because you just freeze them whole. If you can blanch them, but they'll pop. So,
interesting.
To dehydrate, some people blanch them first before they dehydrate. That's a whole other thing. But yeah, I just go and I look it up. I'll just look it up on their website.
The experts.
Yeah, and just do it that way.
And I'm sorry to make you do this, but can you say the name of it's the
Yeah,
Just because I'm going to put the link in here for everybody. I want to make sure I get it right.
it's the National Center for Home Food Preservation.
Gotcha.
And I think the URL is the acronym, so you might want to Google it.
Got it. I got it. So coming to you for folks who are curious about that, like Kathy. Okay. Pray continue. Back to freezing.
All right. Well, most of the time we might be asking, okay, is this method right for me? So the personal question that I like to have you ask yourself is, how do you normally eat the product? So I mentioned that this gentleman said that he and his family only love green peas that are frozen. Well, my husband cannot stand frozen green peas, but he loves them canned. So you need to consider your family's personal preference. Do you normally eat frozen green peas or frozen green beans or frozen corn, or do you normally eat canned? So sometimes it's hard to change a person's preference in this area. So just consider how you normally eat it. Personally, I freeze peppers, onions, carrots for sautés, shredded zucchini for zucchini bread, blueberries, strawberries, and corn for soups. But, you can use corn for anything else too. But a lot of times we like to eat canned corn. So the frozen corn I'll use for soups, but that's just a personal preference. And that's just kind of a guideline to tell you in case you're kind of curious what I do, but your list may be a little bit different. So before we go to water bath canning, were there any other questions? That you saw, Ashley? Are you still there?
Oh, sorry. I took myself off mute, but didn't put myself back in the stream.
Okay.
I think we're good for right now. So everybody knows I dropped the link to what the experts say about blanching and how long to blanch things and which things you blanch. That's in the chat. So take a look at that and hope it helps.
Awesome. Okay. So the next one is water bath canning. The pros to water bath canning are, well, number one, it's cheap equipment, easy to get started. You really don't need a lot of equipment. I started out with a stock pot. It's not what I use now, but if you have a budget or you just want to use what you have, water bath canning is the way to go. It is not overwhelming. It's not hard to learn. You do have a longer shelf life than with frozen, the shelf life product. And it's ideal for small batches. You don't have to have a huge canner load to do something. I have, water bath canned 2 jars before. So you don't have to have a huge amount to water bath can. The cons are it does use a lot of water because when you fill up your pot to cover the jars, the water needs to come like 2 inches above those jars. And so that's a lot of water. And then you also have a limited amount of products that you can water bath can safely. So we're going to be talking about pressure canning, which is different. So you may wonder, okay, which ones can I can in the water bath method compared to the pressure canning method? Because we're going to talk about pressure canning next. But water bath canning candidates include high acid fruits, which are going to be almost all of your fruits, jams, jellies, peaches, almost all your fruits. There are only a few fruits, and most of us are not going to can those anyway. They can be canned with water bath. There's also medium acid vegetables like tomatoes that you add an acid to. So without getting too technical, it's the acid amount that prevents the dangerous stuff from growing. And so that's why you pressure can products that don't have enough acid, because you're able to get the temperature higher. With water bath canning, if you have more acid, then the bad stuff is not going to grow in the jars. And so with tomato sauce, tomato paste, diced tomatoes, you're adding an acid source, and usually that's lemon juice or citric acid when you're following a tested and approved recipe. And I do mention a tested and approved salsa. Salsa does have added vegetables that are not low acid, but you can add a sufficient amount of acid to be able to water bath can lots of different salsas, but you can't just choose. I wouldn't recommend choosing just any salsa recipe. I would recommend using a tested and approved salsa recipe And that's going to be from the National Center for Home Food Preservation or the Ball Blue Book or any, trusted canning source. And when I say tested, in a lab, they canned these recipes and they tested for levels of botulism or I think it's botulism. But anyway, they tested to make sure that that stuff was not growing. If you chose to water bath can something like a salsa that hasn't been tested, then you're definitely taking a risk. So that's why I always recommend, if you're wanting to can safely, always follow those approved and tested recipes from high quality sources, which I can talk about more about those later. But also you've got, as candidates for water bath canning, you've got pickled products. So you've got cucumbers, which become pickles, but you've also got okra, beans, beets, asparagus. You can pickle those in a vinegar solution, and that vinegar is that acid. And that's what makes you be able to water bath can those products into a shelf stable product. If you want to get started with water bath canning, if you just want to go bare basic, you just mainly need a stock pot. You will need jars, lids, and bands. If you want to go a little bit more advanced, which is basically just going to save you time and energy, you can actually buy a water bath canning pot, which is a little bit larger. It's going to have ridges on the bottom because you really need something to lift those jars up to prevent breakage on the bottom. If you just use a stock pot, what I've done instead is I would put extra canning bands on the bottom. Not ideal, but it does make sure that the bottom of those jars are not touching that heat source without any airflow underneath. So you can buy a water bath canning pot, or you can just use a pressure canner. So if you decide to get a pressure canner, just use it, take off the lid, and just use it as your vessel. And then I also recommend a canning kit, which would be a funnel, the little thing that the air bubbles, that you take out air bubbles in certain parts of your recipes, your jar lifter. Those things are going to be invaluable, and those canning kits are not expensive. So I would recommend that as well. So when you're trying to decide whether water bath canning is right for you, the question you should ask again is, what do you normally eat that you can water bath can? For me, I water bath can salsa. I do jams and jellies and pickles and pickled products. And I also do tomato sauce and tomato paste. Now, tomato sauce and tomato paste can be pressure canned just as well. So sometimes I'll do just whichever one I feel like it, but you can water bath can those as well. So any questions on water bath canning before we go into pressure canning? Ashley? Okay, I will move on because I'm not seeing any questions from you in the chat here. Okay, so pressure canning is actually kind of similar to water bath canning in that it's canning. You're going to be ending up with a product that's in a sealed jar. And for me, the pros is that it's less fuss. I personally enjoy pressure canning the most. It does have a longer shelf life than freezing. It has a wider variety of uses because you can pressure can more of your vegetables that you can't water bath can. And then it also uses less water. The pressure canning pot is only going to require a few inches of water as compared to a water bath canning pot is going to require, like I said, several inches above your jars. And so this is going to use less water, which is also going to make it easier to manage. The cons of pressure canning is that, number one, it is a little bit more expensive to get started, mainly because you have to buy a pressure canner. I bought a Presto pressure canner off of Amazon back in 2013, I believe, and I've been using it ever since. The only thing that I've done is I bought a new seal for it, and I did get it tested with my extension service. They usually do this for free, and it's still reading at the correct pounds of pressure this many years later. You're actually supposed to get that tested yearly, but I did not until this year. But my whole point is that you don't have to buy an expensive pressure canner. The one that I used, I mean, it's still, I think it was like $85 or something. I don't know how much they cost now, but it's not a cheap thing compared to the others, but it's lasted me all these years. Also, a con is that until you kind of get the feel for your particular heat source, whether that's, a stove, or I like to use my outdoor canning kitchen with the propane. Sometimes it's a little bit tricky to maintain the proper pressure. You see that picture there. You're trying to, depending on the recipe, maintain a certain pounds of pressure for a certain period of time. And then another con is that a lot of people are scared to pressure can. They hear horror stories about pressure canners blowing up. Well, I'll tell you that modern pressure canners, they have safety features that make this extremely unlikely. I've honestly never heard about it in the modern day. And if it makes you feel better, my husband actually works with pressurized steam for a living, and he's never worried about this. So he knows what can happen with pressure, and it's not been a problem. So that, as long as you're following the recipe and you're watching as you're doing the canning process and you're following all the methodology here, the safety issue, you're going to be good. And as far as what you need, equipment, you do need a pressure canner. There's no way around that. You cannot use a pressure cooker as a pressure canner. A pressure canner is completely different. You have to get something that is meant for pressure canning. You can use a pressure canner as a pressure cooker, but not the other way around. So I know that's confusing. And there's no way to safely pressure can in an Instant Pot either. So I've been asked that as well. Just like with water bath canning, you'll need jars, lids, and bands. And then a canning kit would be another thing that you would need either way. So to decide whether pressure canning is right for you, you will probably want to ask, what foods do I normally eat that require pressure canning? That is one of the main reasons that I bought a pressure canner my first year, is because I knew that the only way that we ate green beans was canned. I knew the only way that we eat peas is canned, black-eyed peas. Those are the things we eat all the time. So I knew we eat them canned. That's the way I wanted to grow and preserve them. And then another question, though, would be, would I be happy with preserving them a different way? If you're on the fence at whether you want to do this, let's say you're thinking about green beans. Are you okay with them frozen? And are green beans the only things that you might want to pressure can? Well, and if you're okay with them frozen, it may not be worth it to you. So it's just look at, in my family, that would have never gone over because, we just don't eat them frozen. That's a personal preference. And then the other question is, am I willing to learn and overcome my fear? And here's what I am telling you. Following recipes from trusted sources is really the only thing that I have ever done. And I've never worried about it. Well, maybe the first year it was a little intimidating just because I'd never done it before. But if you are following recipes from trusted sources, you don't have to worry about so many of the things like, is this going to kill my family? Is this going to poison us all? That's really not a concern as long as you're following the resources that are out there. My personal preferences for pressure canning, as I mentioned, green beans, peas, black-eyed peas, stewed tomatoes. Stewed tomatoes need to be pressure canned because they have additional vegetables in the product, like peppers and celery and things like that. That needs to be pressure canned. It can't be water bath canned because of the ratio of those. And then shelled beans are also good to can, like pinto beans and black beans I've done. So those are my preferences for pressure canning. And then if you get a pressure canner, a side benefit is you can can your own chicken broth. And that's what I do fairly often. Anytime we smoke a chicken or something like that, I turn it into broth and I can it. And that itself saves a lot of money, pressure canning chicken broth. So even though that didn't come out of your garden, that is a definite benefit, I think, to pressure canning. Okay, before we move on to our final one, dehydrating, any other questions on canning?
First, can you see me and hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. Our internet just completely cut off for a second there. I've moved closer to the router now, and have one question about the trusted sources for recipes. Again, I'm asking about guidelines here, which maybe you do or don't have, but are there are there any red flags that you might want to be on the lookout for sources that are less expert or knowledgeable maybe than what you would consider to be a trusted source?
Okay, well, let's start with the first question on trusted sources. Any of the Ball books, like the Ball Blue Book of Home Preserving, of Blanching, all of those are going to be trusted. They have been for years. Although I will say, I would recommend you get a more recent edition, just because some of the ones are really, really old and followed practices that aren't considered safe anymore, but the recent
Mm-hmm.
again, that same website, the National Center for Home Food Preservation, they have all your basic recipes that you would want to get started. Another book that I have been using a lot and I absolutely love it. I actually use several of these recipes in Harvest a Kitchen. So I actually demonstrate how to do these. It's called Foolproof Preserving. And I love that one. To answer your other question, red flags. So a couple of years ago, I have a cousin who does lots of flea market shopping, and she found this old, like handwritten book of old recipes from, 50s, 50s, 40s, whatever. And they
Sounds
looked,
like a good find.
I'm sorry.
It sounds like a good find.
Yeah, it was amazing. But I was a little skeptical with some of those practices, partly because I'm sure that it never killed grandma or whatever, but we know more now than we did then. And so I would be careful about things like that are older, because we know more now. Also, just if you read, it's kind of like the whole thing. If you look at a dollar bill enough, you'll know what a counterfeit is. If you're looking at the tested sources and then someone shows a method that you've never heard before, you might want to question that.
You're
Especially
like,
if it's canning in an oven, no, those types of things. So if you're
don't do that.
looking at the ones that are, that you can trust, then it helps you be able to spot the other ones and it just makes you question. I will say that there was a method in the Foolproof Preserving book that I'd never heard before. And it was called, and I talk about this actually in Harvest a Kitchen. It's the way I started doing pickles. It's called low temperature pasteurization, I think. Anyway, I was skeptical because I'd never heard of it before, but I looked it up, and sure enough, the National Center for Home Food Preservation listed that as a safe canning method. So just because you heard about it doesn't mean it's not accurate, but do a little bit more research just to make sure.
Which is, that's a good guideline for fact checking in general, is if you can verify it somewhere else, that if you're not totally confident, which, like Kathy is mentioning, that she's got her first pressure cooker, a little intimidated. So if you're curious, then do a little bit of extra verification and, just to be on the safe side.
Yes. And like I said, I demonstrate all this in the course I'll talk about a little bit further later, Harvest a Kitchen. But there are also canning courses that I recommend. I have those linked in the course that actually teach you how to can step by step. I'm more like showing you how to do it, but there are really good online courses that teach you how to can step by step as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Well, let's get into dehydrating, because this is one that I have embraced more and more over the past several years, and it's becoming one of my favorite things to do. In fact, I don't think you can hear it, but I've got peppers that I'll get ready to grind into chili powder dehydrating right now, and parsley dehydrating. So I'll have parsley over the year. So it's one of my new favorites. The pros to dehydrating is it is easy. When I'm telling you it's the easiest method that you'll use, it's the easiest method. And there's minimal storage space required for the end product, because you're going from a large product and you take all the moisture out of it and it gets really, really small. I think, if I'm not mistaken, when I was measuring my green peppers, I think it was like a quarter of a cup of green peppers ended up being, or was it a half a cup, ended up being a tablespoon. So it was condensed quite a bit. So if you have problems with not having enough storage space, dehydrating, is definitely a viable option. There are some cons, though, to dehydrating. And number one is, if you choose to use your oven, most ovens don't go low enough for most items, specifically herbs. So herbs are typically dehydrated between 95 and 105, and ovens are not going to go that low. Now, your vegetables are going to go a little bit higher, but still, even my peppers are at 125. Most ovens are not going to go that low. So hang drying is also an option for a lot of people, or drying in the sun. But I live in Arkansas, which is extremely humid. And any type of humidity is going to make dehydrating difficult because you've got more moisture in the air. And so I rarely hang dry anything. The only things that I hang dry are thyme and sometimes rosemary I can. So that's a limited option. So one of the cons I would say for dehydrating is that ideally you will want to purchase a dehydrator. And honestly, that's what makes the whole process easier, is actually having a dehydrator. And then finally, depending on what you're dehydrating, the final product isn't always palatable. So if you are wanting to dehydrate something that ends up being the main side dish, the texture might be a little bit not to your liking. It doesn't mean they'll be bad. It just might be a little bit different. So it just kind of depends on what you choose to dehydrate, whether it ends up serving your needs or not. So that you may be wondering then which vegetables or which recipes are or is dehydrating more suited for. This again will be a personal preference, but in general, as far as which can be dehydrated, almost all of them can be dehydrated. It's just a matter of, will the finished product actually be something you're happy with? Herbs are ideal. They're perfect candidates for dehydrating, and you will save so much money if you start growing your own herbs. And then lately I've been growing my own, ingredients for spices like paprika and chili powder and cayenne pepper. When you start doing that, you're going to be saving yourself a lot of money because herbs and spices are expensive. And then other vegetables that will be ingredients are ideal for dehydrating, in my opinion, if they're not standalone dishes. I love dehydrating onions and peppers and celery. Those are the main ones. I also dehydrate okra to be able to put into gumbo in the wintertime. So that's another option. Eggplant is good to dehydrate, and you can put it in an eggplant parmesan because it's going to be an ingredient in that dish. And then fruit leathers are also an option if you have a lot of fruit. I've done some strawberry fruit leather before that it didn't last very long because I ate it so fast. It was so good. And then you can also dry fruit. So I will dehydrate my blueberries because I get a lot of blueberries off my bushes, and I use them in baked goods throughout the year. The equipment, as I mentioned, you can get away with hang drying or sun drying or even a low oven, maybe. To me, I think that would be a little bit more difficult to figure out how to do well. I haven't done a whole lot of that. You can, though. Many people do, especially if you live in an area that's not humid. Intermediate, you would be looking at an inexpensive dehydrator. The one you see here in the picture is a Nesco Garden Master, and that's what I started out with. And so if you're just dipping your toes into the world of dehydrating, this is a really good option because it's more of an inexpensive option, and it does a good job. But if you find yourself like me, ending up dehydrating a whole lot more, the Excalibur is considered the Cadillac of dehydrators, and it's an investment, and it was really hard for me to invest in. But once I did, I've never looked back. It has been so, so good and has enabled me to dehydrate so much more. So those are kind of your options for the equipment that you would need. When it comes to dehydrating, your personal preferences to ask are, how will you use this vegetable or fruit? If you're going to be using it as an ingredient, like I mentioned before, it would be optimum. How much time do you have? Now, I mentioned that this is the fastest way. I'm talking about hands-on time. But depending on what you're dehydrating, when I'm dehydrating my chili peppers for chili powder, they will take about 12 hours to dehydrate. Now, they can't. The dehydrator stays on overnight. It can, but you do have to babysit it to some degree to make sure, turn it off. There is some wiggle room there. But how much time do you have as far as, if you don't have a lot of time, dehydrating would probably be the best option for you. And then what equipment do you have, or what equipment can you get? Really, the only equipment you need is a dehydrator. The other thing you might want to get, I love a mortar and pestle for grinding those herbs, especially the leafy herbs once I dehydrate them. And then with my spices, I use a dedicated small coffee grinder to grind up my spices, or garlic for garlic powder, or things like that. So that might be something extra you might want for grinding some of your herbs. And my advice is to try it in small amounts first. That's what I did last year. I tried doing the green peppers and onions dehydrated in a small amount, and I used it throughout the year in the winter to make sure that I liked it. And because I didn't want to dehydrate it all and then be like, okay, I don't like this. So I tried it a little bit, and then I was able to figure out what I liked and what I didn't. So when it comes to dehydrating, because that final product may be a little different than what you're used to, then I would advise you to try it in small amounts first and see what you like. Again, you may have mentioned or may have deduced that my favorite things for dehydrating are herbs, onions, bell peppers, spice peppers, garlic, eggplant, okra, blueberries, and also flowers. So calendula is something I dehydrate a lot because I infuse it in oil for facial moisturizer and things like that. So before we move on, did you have any other questions on dehydrating?
Looks like we are good to go. We've got some folks with some experience dehydrating. We agree that it's a nice, simple method and simple approach. I'm actually just curious to know if anybody else has anything that they dehydrate that in addition to the list that Jill provided, because I'm always excited to think about porcini mushrooms. That's the big one. I live in California, and we would do some mushroom foraging, and dehydrating porcini was always like such a treat to have later on. Yeah, looks like we're good on questions. So let's put it all together.
All right. Well, putting it all together, what you need to know is how you plan to use or eat or use a product. So you want to know the end goal. That's really the purpose. And it's something that I've learned over the years. When I first started, I'm like, I've got to preserve everything. And I didn't really consider what the end goal was. So you want to look at how do you want to use it ultimately. You want to look at what equipment you already have that you can use or what equipment you can get. As we've learned this year, people were on, the canners were on back order for months. I still have an order of canning lids that's been on back order for 15 months. So some of the equipment is going to be a little bit more difficult to get right now. Hopefully things have caught up. I haven't honestly checked recently, but you do need to look at what equipment you have or can get. And then is the final result worth the time you'll need to invest? And that's a big question. Is it really worth your time? And I have to be honest, that's something that I asked myself this year when I was canning pickles. We eat pickles occasionally, but we don't eat a lot of pickles. So next year, is that going to be worth it? Or is my time better canning something else rather than the couple of jars of pickles we go through a year? Would it be just as easy to, buy it from my Mennonite farmers market that sell them? Those are the type of things that you want to ask yourself. Is the final result worth the time you'll need to invest for it? Okay, there was that blank screen, and I don't know why it keeps coming up. But speaking of time, because we're talking about time, that's a huge thing for me and for so many of us. Much of my time as a beginner was spent teaching myself how to do it all. And my question for you is, now that you understand the basics, would you like me to walk through how I preserve my products in my kitchen? Maybe your priority is a yummy tasting salsa, and you want to know exactly how to make it. I spent years trying to figure out how to make a salsa that my family liked. For a while there, I grew all our tomato products from the garden except salsa because none of us could find a recipe. I finally found actually two, and one of them is I demonstrate in this course, Harvest to Kitchen, I'm going to tell you about. Maybe you want to pressure can, but you would like to see it done in action so that you can have enough confidence to try it yourself. That is an intimidating factor to so many people, but I'm telling you, as you see in this picture here, canning green beans is the easiest thing. It's the easiest thing that I can, but you have to just get a little bit of a feel for how to pressure can, and watching someone do it can make a big difference in learning and having enough confidence to do it yourself. Maybe you'll be doing some freezing, but the idea of blanching seems intimidating. In Harvest to Kitchen, I show you how I blanch and freeze my carrots, and they last me all year. Or maybe you want to try your hand at dehydrating, and you can add that to what you're already doing, but you need some guidance to get started. Like I said, I dehydrate all of the herbs that I grow, oregano right here, and then also many of my vegetables now. Or maybe you're kind of new at gardening in general and you need more guidance on when to harvest your vegetables and herbs in the first place. There is guidance on when's the best time to harvest lettuce. Even though we don't preserve lettuce, you can see in here, I have so many people ask me about when to harvest lettuce. So with each of these vegetables that I talk about actually preserving, I take it a step back and I teach you when's the best time to actually harvest those, because that's going to make a difference in whether you're eating them fresh or you're preserving them. Or maybe you have a harvest of garlic or onions and you want to cure them for long-term storage, because we would love for those root crops to last as long as possible. So if any of that resonated with you, you have two options. The first one is to teach yourself, and this is exactly what I did, so I'm telling you it can be done, but it will require lots of reading and lots of research, and that equaled a lot of time for me. Or you can watch and learn. And I know so many people are more visual learners. We can do it so much better when we can see somebody actually doing it. And so that's what I did when I came up with my online course, Harvest to Kitchen. Is last year, I actually just took a camera and I filmed my process of my preserving, from freezing, canning, and dehydrating, and then even out in the garden as I was preserving. I filmed my entire process because I wish that I would have had someone to actually show me exactly how to do these things. My goal with Harvest to Kitchen is that you would go from being nervous and unsure of how you'll preserve your harvest to having the confidence that you have the tools and the know-how to begin putting back food for months after the harvest finishes. That is the most rewarding feeling ever. I don't think I will ever get over it, being able to open something that was mine, that I grew and preserved myself. So in the course Harvest to Kitchen, what you get in it is 14 modules, over 50 video demonstrations, and printable recipes that go along with most of them. Most of the ones that I do, I have printable recipes on. The only ones that I don't are the ones that came from a cookbook that have a copyright, but then I do show you where to find that. But what I'm going through in this course are going to include tomatoes, cucumbers, green beans, garlic, onions, lettuce, peas, carrots, squash, and 9 herbs. So I'm going through all of those. You can see kind of a sampling here on tomatoes, talking about preserving tomato sauce and paste, salsa. And then my favorite way to actually turn my tomatoes into sauce is by using a KitchenAid fruit and vegetable strainer attachment. So I talk to you about how I do that. But then if you don't have that, then I also teach you how to peel tomatoes in preparation for sauce or diced tomatoes or whatever you want to use. So this is kind of a snapshot of what you'll get, when and how to harvest vegetables, how to prepare those things before you preserve them. We'll talk about water bath canning, blanching, freezing. I also have a tutorial on how to use reusable canning lids, because there are canning lids that you can reuse, which were a lifesaver for me last year when I couldn't get canning lids. And then I'll also talk to you about how to cure root crops like onions and garlic. And then we also have a whole section on dehydrating herbs and vegetables, and then also options for how to store them. We also have some fun recipes, like I do a lot of stuff with peppermint. So like my peppermint all-purpose cleaner. I don't buy cleaner anymore because I make it myself with my own peppermint. So there's some fun recipes tucked in there as well. So Harvest to Kitchen is normally $149, but with this Teachable discount, we've brought it to $129 today. Or you can do 3 payments for $47. But more than that, and this is what makes me excited about sharing this course with you and for this, so many others who have gone through it in the last 2 years, is that you'll gain the skills that you need to preserve your garden's harvest, not only in 2021, but also in years to come, and have fun doing it. It is so much fun to do this once you actually have the confidence to do it and you feel so accomplished. But like I said, it's not just about this year. Maybe your harvest is winding down and you don't have a lot of preservation ahead of you, but you want to think about what you want to do next year. And the skills that you have now are skills you can pass on that I wish that were passed on to me. And we can break that cycle of not teaching these important things to the next generations. And so that's what I'm excited about teaching, maybe more than even this year's harvest, is the future possibilities. And the truth is, you don't need to be an expert food preserver to enjoy your harvest for months to come. And in Harvest to Kitchen, I would love for you to just jump in there and try it out. I do have a 14-day happiness guarantee. So if you jump in there and you realize it's not for you, you can email me and I can give you a no questions asked refund. But most people who do go into Harvest to Kitchen, they love it. I actually got an email yesterday from one of my students that she just canned, gosh, how many quarts? I can't remember how many quarts of tomato sauce and bruschetta. Actually, I didn't have anything on bruschetta, but she learned how to can and she got bruschetta from her garden. And I was so excited for her. So I would love to invite you to join me in my kitchen. This is a picture of me doing the salsa, and I can try to show you kind of what works for our family, and you can adapt it to what works for you. So now if there are any other questions, I'd love to answer them for you.
Yay. Thank you so much, Jill. This is such a beautiful presentation, which Canva is fantastic. I'm big fan. But including so much relevant and practical information. It's really great to see a set of processes that folks can try, and you so clearly laid out the pros and cons of each, at what stage you might want to try a particular process versus another, and what makes those selections right for you based on what your garden is producing, where you're located, how much time you have, all of those things. So thank you so much for breaking that down for us. Audience, if you have any final questions for Jill, please do drop those in the chat. I will just, in the meantime, remind you that we will send out a link to the replay for this session, so you'll have access to all of Jill's great information. And the course that she has referenced I dropped a link to it a few times in the chat, and it's also pinned to the top of the YouTube page that you're watching right now, so definitely check that out. We have a few folks asking about the course itself, Jill, and how can you just talk a little bit more about the format and structure of it, and then also how long the deal is available for?
Okay, the structure is, most of it is video based, and I try to make them, like, sometimes these things I'm in the kitchen for a couple hours, so I don't make them that long. So I think the longest is 23 minutes, and a lot of them are really short. So you're basically going through and you're watching me. And then if it's a recipe that has not been copyrighted, I actually have an easy way to print out all the recipes, or whichever ones you want to do from the course itself. I also have an entire page of resources that I recommend from, like I mentioned, the Foolproof Preserving book that I reference, and all the websites, and then a trusted canning course that I recommend if you want to go any further into that. And I knew you were going to ask me this. I don't remember how long we ended up saying that was going to be available. Was it a week?
Let's find out. I can write
that down, but I'll just weeks ago.
Click on it right now and see what it says on the page. 30 days. Let's see here. So I have. Oh yeah, it doesn't say here. It says $129 for one time purchase, but it doesn't have a list for the specific date. So Kathy, I will find out and let you know. Actually, give me just a second here, because I can ping my team and see what they have to say. In the meantime, would love to just highlight the value of expertise curation, which seems like is a big part of what you've done in this course. It's like part of what's so intimidating about a process like this, especially if you are trying to start from scratch like you yourself did, is that initial hurdle of sifting through mountains of information and trying to figure out which options are right for you. So I love the approach that you've taken in your course design, which has to do with you've done all of this preliminary research and trial and error and gone through these processes, and now you're sharing that wisdom so that somebody else who wants to try can kind of be able to focus on, oh, okay, so here are the recipes that I want to try. Here are, you know, the things that I need to know, the compare and contrast modes of preservation for this food or this food, which is so often the barrier that most folks encounter, right? That keeps them from trying something new. So I love that approach. Folks would love to please join me in thanking Jill for everything that she's shared with us today. We will definitely have the information for you on the special offer and how long it's available in the email that will come out to you after this event. So Kathy, stay tuned for that. You'll see it in your inbox pretty soon. And if you have any other questions, you can always reach out to the Discover team, and we'll do our best to answer those for you. Jill, thank you so much for everything that you have shared with us today. I'm excited to explore some of these techniques.
Thank you. It was fun. I always love information.
Well, we will have to have you back. I'm really excited to get like nitty gritty into some garlic harvesting and what else what else you know about, like, what's the good beta on garlic. So maybe we'll have to schedule another event around one of those workshops that you're doing.
Sounds good.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. Hope that you have a great rest of your day, and we will see you all next time. Bye everyone.